If you put 90, if you put turbos in any type of station wagon that ever had existed, even if it was 2021, you deserve to be in jail.
You should get an old station wagon and put spinners on it.
All right. Let me get through this stuff, and then you guys can talk about modified station wagons. Like what they really good ones. All right, so I appreciate you guys showing up, first of all. And then I'm going to move on to section 2 here of chapter 12. Like I said, last week I'm flipping 11 and 12. Realistically, I'm not going to pass over the next 2 chapters, just because we're kind of running out of time. I just want to make sure you guys get some information. Friday, it's been about a week, right? We can start on chapter 12 here, which is essentially kind of late Middle Ages, but in particular the focus is on 2 kind of events or movements here that kind of overlap that period, the Renaissance and Reformation. So on Friday, we talked about the Renaissance, which is this kind of artistic kind of movement here, revolution, where, and remember, it's a French term. What does that mean? What does Renaissance mean? Remember?
Like
It's trying to
reviving.
What's that?
Revive.
Revival, rebirth, right? And it's a revival or rebirth of essentially Greek and Roman culture, right? So like it's during this era where they coined the term the Dark Ages. Somebody named Petrarch was the one who kind of first coined it. So basically looking back to that era, those people that basically were unintelligent, who lived in the Dark Age, didn't get kind of like they lost the knowledge that eventually these people were able to kind of conjure up. If we had a test, the question on the test would be, in what country does the Renaissance start? Particularly the northern part, yeah. Italy, right? Okay. Florence is often considered the birthplace of the Renaissance, but other places like Venice, Milan, Rome, and that. But it kind of, and nothing really occurs like overnight. This kind of unfolds over a few centuries, and it's with kind of hindsight that people are able to kind of delve into that, if you will. All right. And so it's not that art was invented at this time, but it's certain things that we use in kind of modern art that have their origins here. Like art we was talking about in chapter 1. Remember long in August we were talking about the Cro-Magnons and the whole cave paintings that you had at Luxor in France and Spain and Germany. Pablo Picasso, you ever heard of Picasso? You ever heard of Pablo Picasso? When he visited Luxor, he had a famous quote where he said, "We've invented nothing," meaning basically that art is inherent in our DNA, basically. The idea to kind of like basically kind of express ourselves and the need to is inherent in what we kind of are as our kind of species, right? The thing about the Renaissance, though, that kind of like there's again, people don't really, it doesn't happen overnight, but there's certain like kind of values and ideas that kind of like transition from medieval art into Renaissance art. Those 3 values. The first one would be the celebration of the individual, all right? So in the Middle Ages, there was art, but a lot of that art was done for the glory of the church and God, right? And a lot of times the painters, the artists that would paint these kind of murals or they would kind of paint the stained glass, we didn't know their names. They wouldn't leave their names because they were doing it for the glory of the church. It's here during the Renaissance where the artist is kind of elevated to rock star status, all right? And with that, also the people that would normally not be kind of the patrons of the arts, they're going to use that artist as a kind of a status symbol, if you will. All right. So we start to know who these artists are. All right. We also start to kind of know who their subjects are, and these subjects are kind of unlikely figures at times. All right. So 2 things that kind of emerge out of this to kind of like show the celebration of the individual is essentially kind of like we see portrait paintings for people who wouldn't normally have portrait paintings. All right. People like the Medici. This is kind of like a connection here where we talk about the High Middle Ages, where we start to see the rise of the merchant class, the middle class, the bourgeois, the burghers, if you will. All right. So prior to the Middle Ages, the only people that were really getting portraits were generally kings, nobles, and like popes and church officials and stuff. Now we have people like the Medici, the Bulgarians in Germany, and the Pazis, the Sforza, all these people that essentially are basically not only getting kind of portraits painted of themselves, but other families as well. All right, and then like books written about these various artists and these other kind of like merchants and stuff like that. So we start to see kind of a new kind of class of people who are just as important politically, because a lot of times these nobles and kings are going to them for loans to wage wars or various other things. They're starting to kind of flex a little bit. All right. Another one is the love of classical learning and this concept that emerges called humanism. All right. Humanism is this philosophy, this idea that based kind of on Greek philosophy that people are rational beings. A lot of this is on Aristotle and his works then. So someone like Petrarch, who's the one who kind of coined the term Dark Ages, was considered the first humanist. If you guys go to college, they have like the things called the humanities, right? It's a kind of a catch-all term and kind of for basically classical learning, which is Greek and Rome, right? And so we start to see people like Petrarch and others like advocate for basically kind of delving back into learning Latin, but also learning kind of like philosophy, all the kind of like, mathematicians of the Greeks and the sculptors of the art, the Romans and that, as the skeleton key to becoming a well-rounded individual. Humanism is basically the kind of the underlying kind of like foundation that kind of permeates all throughout the Renaissance. All right, and then the other one is simply enjoying yourself. All right, you have to keep in mind that the Renaissance emerges out of the Black Death. All right, and you have people that essentially kind of the idea is life is short. Right, people like the Medici were famous for the idea, what's the purpose of wealth if you can't really enjoy it? All right, and that's why the Medici not only commissioned like paint works of art for themselves, but also for the city of Florence, if you will. All right, so humanists taught that you can like basically kind of like show off without really kind of offending God. All right, in the Middle Ages, a lot of people were basically encouraged to be very pious and subdued and stuff like that, with the exception of those who were basically the people who were in power, right? But this is where it's a direct kind of line you draw from the Black Death into this idea of basically kind of like enjoying things. And that enjoyment things is just basically everything from just like food, drink, but also to things like art and stuff like that. So generally, if I had a test, this would be like one of those like all the following steps type questions. Now, like I said, the Renaissance doesn't just occur immediately overnight. And before we talk about all the Ninja Turtles, there's a couple artists that I think you need to know that will lay the foundation for that. All right, one of them is a guy named Giotto da Ponte. All right, simply sometimes referred to as Giotto. All right, now Giotto is this kind of bridging of medieval art with Renaissance art. Born in the 1200s, so before really the Renaissance was actually kind of really labeled as such, he's that connection. Now Giotto was also an architect. He's the one who designed the bell tower there at the Cathedral of Florence. His kind of contribution to Renaissance art, or at least the kind of like the influence of that, is the reemergence of frescoes, which are basically kind of paintings on plaster, usually on walls and stuff like that. He was famous in Assisi for, at the Basilica there, of all these frescoes that told the life of St. Francis of Assisi. All right. Now, Giotto is essentially going to try to make his figures a little bit more lifelike. During the Middle Ages, during the medieval times, a lot of times you would have, if you had paintings, they tended to be 1 or 2 dimensional. You have individuals like kind of facing like this, front ways or side. Right? There's not a lot of depth to it. Giotto does a slight kind of turn in some of these subjects and essentially kind of creates a 3-dimension with that. Right? So that's where kind of Giotto's kind of credit is there. There's an image. This is what I believe Giotto looked like. I think I showed this painting when I was talking about St. Francis. This is part of that whole like series of kind of like the life of St. Francis. This is the moment when St. Francis gives up his worldly possessions. He's basically stripped naked. His father's holding his clothes, and then there's the bishop there kind of holding that. Just like little things like this light kind of turn there for that guy's head. And then you see the hand of God there, and even like the kind of the steps in the background indicating kind of Assisi. This is another fresco of, this is called Morning St. Francis. When I was and this isn't at the Basilica, it's in another church, but when I was at the Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi, there was a number of those frescoes that were basically being retouched and restored. So a lot of times you see a lot of fading with these. They have to constantly be kind of restored, if you will. But again, kind of like see like just like this kind of simple like hand gesture expression there. This guy kind of basically holding the hand of St. Francis. So it's a little bit more realistic than what we see traditionally in the medieval age. This is his version of what we call Lamentation, which is the moment in which Jesus is taken down from the cross. Like stuff like this. This is supposed to be St. Peter, and even like kind of the parting of St. Peter's beard. The image here of kind of the halos of the saints. And then this is his take on the popular subject of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. Now, if you look at Jesus here, the thing about it is he looks kind of like a man to a certain extent. His face is very much. Now, this was something that is very much a part of medieval kind of art, and this is where Giotto is still kind of in that kind of era here. One of the factors that our historians like to look at is the kind of transformation of the baby Jesus from one that was kind of looked like more like a kind of a grown man in baby's body to an actual baby. So Fox, someone plays Fox video that kind of talks about
So you're going to the museum and it's great. The guards check your bag to make sure you won't, I don't know, shoot a painting. You go up some fancy escalators, you see naked statues, and then it happens. You see a super ugly medieval baby. Why did medieval babies look like ugly middle-aged men? I mean, this baby looks like he wants to tell you that a boat is just a money pit. It might seem like medieval artists were just bad at drawing, but it turns out that babies in medieval art are actually ugly for a reason. While there were breakthroughs in anatomy and perspective that happened later in the Renaissance, ugly medieval babies were an intentional choice before that time. Somebody told you to paint like Pablo Picasso and you gave them Norman Rockwell, you'd have screwed up. And it was the same way for medieval artists working in churches in Italy. It's because most of these babies were depictions of Jesus and Mary. They were influenced by the idea of the homunculus, which is Latin for little man. These babies look like Benjamin Button because philosophers believe Jesus was born perfectly formed and unchanged. The adult Jesus was represented in the baby Jesus until the Renaissance when everything changed. Generally, we think of the Middle Ages as lasting from around the 5th to the 15th century, and it kind of overlapped the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century. Renaissance probably began in Florence, Italy, but it's important to note that it unfolded over centuries and countries in a time when everything moved slowly. So it wasn't instant beautiful babies everywhere. Still, the change in style did happen, and it happened for a couple of reasons. Suddenly, places like Florence were getting richer, and churches weren't the only places that could afford paintings. People could get their own babies painted, and they wanted them to look like cute, chubby babies, not homunculi. And because the Renaissance was all about classics, they looked at Greek and Roman art, which was all about idealized forms that ditched the medieval abstraction for beauty. And okay, who put that ugly baby there? Anyway, the point is that after the Renaissance, church didn't seem out of place, and neither did cuter pictures of baby Jesus as the Renaissance spread through Europe. And it's kind of stayed that way since. We want babies who look like they need their cheeks pinched, not their prostates checked. We want them chubby and cute. And we want babies that fit our ideals. Because those medieval babies, they have a face that only a mother could love. So
like I said, that's kind of like where Giotto is still kind of in the medieval kind of era with painting. And then another artist, Tommaso di Simone Giovanni, which is more famously known by his nickname Masaccio. He is going to be kind of one of the first ones to kind of really implore that concept of linear perspective, which I kind of talked about when we were talking about the construction of the Duomo, right, with Brunelleschi. Basically, those of you guys who are already artistically inclined, which I'm fascinated by because I myself am not, almost inherently already born with that whole idea. The ability to kind of put something down on paper like Bob Ross does with a painting, basically kind of creating happy trees and kind of something set in like kind of creating distance, kind of 3 dimensions, if you will. Taking kind of a one-dimensional kind of like canvas and then creating something where you have depthness to it. And that's what perspective is. All right. And so that's where Masaccio is essentially kind of his contribution. Unfortunately, Masaccio died at a relatively young age, at the age of 26. But Brunelleschi and Masaccio were contemporaries. So Masaccio probably got a lot of influence from Brunelleschi in that sense. So I'll show you some of these Masaccio paintings. You're not going to be impressed because nothing really impressed you guys. But at the time, it was somewhat impressive. Like this is called Holy Trinity. Obviously, the story of Jesus, the crucifixion here. But it's part of like on the altar here. You see the sense of depthness that's kind of presented in that sense. This is at a chapel in Florence. This column here is called the Expulsion, which shows basically the angel Gabriel escorting, if you will, Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. Now, when they were restoring this in the early part of the 20th century, Adam had a strategically placed fig leaf there. And they determined that was added on probably in the 1700s because the texture of the paint was a little bit different. So again, that's a nod, but we have religious figures, again, the whole idea of kind of Greek and Roman kind of using them new figures. And then this is kind of right next to, kind of bleeds into another kind of fresco. This here shows kind of St. Peter washing his hands after denying knowing Jesus. You gotta go back and remember what Peter's hands. Was that? Oh, look at the door. You got walked all the way up there. Who that? I mean, forget it now. What are you giving me? This one. I mean, like, really, do I need this? You should probably save it. Yeah. No, I got it. I'm saving it. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. That painting is that fresco is called the Honey Tree. Basically, the story of Jesus, kind of chastising kind of money lenders and bankers or whatever, tax collectors. So there's St. Peter in the background there. And again, the kind of use of perspective with the mountains back there, even like kind of the archway up here, like have an open door, slightly open, kind of particular detail. Another thing about Renaissance paintings, a lot of times with frescoes, is the use of colors. You're having your eye kind of being drawn in by certain colors. All right. And so this gives way to our Ninja Turtles. All right. And probably in the early kind of Middle Ages, early Renaissance, I'm sorry, probably the most famous sculptor was the Ninja Turtle, Donatello. All right. Now, Donatello, like when I was talking about Brunelleschi, before he got the contract to win the competition for the structure of the dome, he lost out to Ghiberti with the baptistry door. He was a little salty by that, so him and Donatello actually licked him wrong for a few years. While Brunelleschi was observing things like the Pantheon and stuff like that, Donatello was observing sculpture. So when he comes back, he is patronized, one of the earliest kind of artists to be patronized by the Medici, Cosimo de' Medici. And he was commissioned to create a statue that becomes his version of David, which is a bronze statue. It's the first kind of sculptor statue that's a large freestanding kind of figure in the nude, meaning it's not connected to a wall or anything of that nature. Now, it's a little controversial at the time, because how Donatello took, and David is a popular figure for a lot of artists in Florence because they represent, the Florentines saw themselves as underdogs, and the kind of David and Goliath stories are kind of quintessential that. So this is his version of David. Now, looking at it, you're probably like, good deal, so what? At the time, it's somewhat controversial. Mainly, it's a nude statue, but also how David is kind of portrayed. There's some feminine features there. Art historians believe this was Donatello kind of expressing himself, so that Donatello himself was a homosexual, probably. And while Florence is a progressive city, it's still illegal to be so. The fact that he had a powerful patron like Cosimo to kind of back him up was kind of allowed him to a little bit of kind of artistic freedom. The deal here is that there's a great quote. There was this band called Dillinger Escape Plan where one of the guitar players heard this quote where he said, "No good art comes from comfort," meaning that really like good art should kind of invoke some type of response. All right, and that's what Donatello's David did. There was so much complaints about it that it was taken out of public, and basically Cosimo put it in his own kind of private collection. All right, but it's Donatello's David that's going to lay the foundation for the more famous David by Michelangelo. Ninja Turtles. What was Donatello's color? This was purple. Thank you very much. All right, now we're going to transition into what they call the High Middle Ages and all the rest of the Ninja Turtles here. All right, I'm going to play this video here that's from a art series I have on the High Renaissance. I think it does a pretty good job at basically explaining certain art techniques and stuff. All right, and so this first kind of segment here is on Michelangelo.
Michelangelo Buonarroti was born in 1475 in the town of Caprice when Leonardo was 23. Michelangelo was sent to study the ancient Roman statuary collected in the gardens of Lorenzo de' Medici. From the sculptor who was curator there, he learned a way of twisting his figures into a contrapposto, a twisting of the shoulders while the hips remained frontal. In Lorenzo's court, he rubbed elbows with the leading thinkers of the Renaissance. But Michelangelo never learned polite manners. He was terse and rude. His manners did not win him friends, and he earned himself a broken nose for his rudeness, which disfigured him all of his life. Michelangelo created his first great marble sculpture while in Rome, the Pietà. It is today in St. Peter's Cathedral. It is a single figure of Mary grieving over her dead son, Christ. Christ is limp in death on her knees. The sadness portrayed is beyond words. Every muscle is perfect and relaxed. The life has parted from Christ's limbs. Also, there is something strange about Mary. She is too young to be his mother. Michelangelo's reply was that it was the purity of her soul. Michelangelo hated to imitate a living person unless she or he was beautiful. Like the ancient Greeks, he idealized people into physical perfection. Yet he personally lived miserably, slept in his clothes, and never washed. In the workshop of the Florence Cathedral was a massive block of marble. They nicknamed it the Giant. For 50 years, no artist dared to tackle it. From its slimness, he knew it should contain an adolescent, not quite filled out as yet. From the giant, he carved David, the herd boy who slew Goliath. After working for 2 years, he unveiled his David. The anticipation was feverish. Spectators were awestruck at the heroic size. The boy's hands and head were disproportionately large, just as a teenage boy would be. Every muscle, every vein is sculpted with an accuracy never before seen in marble. The defiant look, the slingshot casually over his left shoulder. He represents youth defiant and so self-assured that he can do whatever he sets himself out to do. The human figure was almost exclusively Michelangelo's sole passion. He studied his predecessors, Giotto, Leonardo, Mantegna. He even dissected corpses. With the human figure, especially in sculpture, which he preferred to painting, he expressed all that he felt. He said that a relief is even more expressive than painting, so that when he painted his Tondo, which is a circular picture of the Holy Family, it looked like a relief. The figures are nearly three-dimensional. They are sculptural, and they are more heroic than tender. Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo to Rome to make a tomb for him in marble. Michelangelo spent months in the great marble quarry of Carrara, choosing the stone for the monument. But when he returned, the Pope had cooled to the idea, and Michelangelo returned to Florence in a huff. Julius demanded that he return. Michelangelo refused, and the city of Florence refused to give him up. Julius threatened to excommunicate the whole city. The two great powers in Italy were on the verge of war over an artist. So keenly did the mighty of the Renaissance crave the glory which only godlike artists could give them. Eventually, Michelangelo did return to Rome, and he was told to paint in fresco the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. For 4 years, he lay on his back, painting into wet plaster. When at last it was ready and the fresco was dry, the Romans came in droves to see the most stupendous pictorial ever created, like a giant comic book. The Sistine Chapel ceiling covers 10,000 square feet of plaster. There are 343 figures, 10 to 18 feet high. The monumental scheme depicts the story of creation and the redemption of man. The architectural frames mark 9 histories. Number 1, the origin of the world, separation of light from darkness, creation of the sun and the moon, separation of the earth and water. Frame 2, the origin of man, the creation of Adam and Eve, temptation and expulsion from the garden. Frame 3, the origins of evil, the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood and the drunkenness of Noah. On either side are giant gloomy figures of prophets and ancient sibyls who predicted the coming of Christ. Da Vinci painted tenderness and mystery. Michelangelo painted sheer, robust energy. Even his women are muscular. In Michelangelo's heaven, everyone's been to the gym. His vision of God is massive and eternal. God creates Adam with such authority that his divinity cannot be questioned. The prophet Daniel has such overpowering force that redemption cannot be doubted, even by brave men. Michelangelo created the kind of man who is more than equal to the task of dominating the earth. even as his mighty God dominates the heaven. 30 years later, he completed the Last Judgment on the back wall of the Sistine. 200 figures, and each one is an entirely different tragedy or triumph. It is a blast of energy which will influence art in the future. But of all the magnificent works which Michelangelo produced, perhaps none so imposing as the great dome over St. Peter's Basilica. It sits, a thing of mystery atop a Greek cross design, on 16 pairs of columns. The dome soars with the grace of a fine sculptor. He lowered the pitch of the dome until it made a restful curve inside and outside. The dome of Michelangelo Buonarroti was the inspiration for the dome over our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. The spirit of the Renaissance is still with us today.
So our second Ninja Turtle and first of the High Renaissance is Michelangelo Buonarroti. But simply we just know him as Michelangelo. What was his color? Orange. All right. You ever heard of the term where they refer to something as a Renaissance man? It really should be Renaissance person. You ever heard that term before? It basically means somebody who was kind of well versed in various disciplines and subjects and stuff like that. Michelangelo, Leonardo are basically kind of that's where we get that kind of like composite character from. So Michelangelo is kind of he's kind of from an early age is kind of his talent is kind of noticed. Matter of fact, he was basically lived amongst the Medici. He was taken in by Lorenzo de Medici. Lorenzo de Medici, who was the grandson of Cosimo de Medici, probably even more politically kind of powerful than his grandfather was, started a school of art. And so he was basically kind of like in that lived amongst the Medici at 13. At 15, there was a story in which he's kind of the quintessential kind of temperamental artist. There was a story in which he was sculpting a satyr, a fawn or whatever. And so while he was doing that, Lorenzo was walking around the school where they're doing it. And he goes to Michelangelo, who's like 15, 16 or something. Basically said, well, that's real nice, but aren't they supposed to be kind of like more like ugly, for a better lack of a term? So Michelangelo looked up at the most powerful man in Florence, grabbed a mallet, and then knocked the nose off of this satyr that he was working on. He's like, how's that? Like, kind of like, leave me alone kind of stuff. So geniuses tend not to like take criticism very well. As a sculptor, obviously his most famous works are the Pietà, which is in Vatican City in Rome, which is basically the Virgin Mary holding the lifeless body of Jesus after taken down from the cross. And then his version of David, which is the quintessential kind of version. So this is the Pietà. Again, you're looking at it, probably not all impressed, but it's impressive in the sense that one, he did this when he was like 20-something years old. And then the detail of this, like the hand imprint of the Virgin Mary, the dress, like kind of how it kind of crumples. So basically, it's the lifeless body of Jesus, the ribs, all that is super detailed. It's in the Vatican, but it's kind of behind like bulletproof glass, like in the distance. In the 80s, there was this guy, he probably suffered from schizophrenia, that actually he was hearing voices, so he attacked us with a hammer, knocked off a couple of the figures of Jesus. I just found out today that one of the guys that subdued that guy was the founder of the City Museum. The guy who created the City Museum over in St. Louis. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago in an unfortunate bulldozer accident there. Yeah, and then this is his version of David, which it was kind of like a middle finger to the Medici. All right, it was sculpted at the time after Lorenzo de Medici died and the Medici were out of power. And so it was in public in the front of the Plaza Vecchio in front of like the kind of the city hall there. Today there's a replica of that's out there. The original one is in the museum called the Accademia, and it's a massive. It stands about 17 feet tall, and then it's on a pedestal, so it's incredibly big. And like you kind of remember when I was there, kind of come out of a room and you go into this one room and around the corner where there's all these kind of unsculpted marbles and that, and then you basically enter into this foyer where basically David is. And again, like I said, it's kind of like the quintessential. We don't mention Donatello's, and it's a little bit of a different take on this. But again, David kind of represented kind of Florence. He kind of was a symbol of Florence. He's kind of like the underdog, if you will. And again, he's also going to delve into paintings, frescoes, and stuff. Probably the most famous kind of frescoes are the paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel is where the College of Cardinals meet, and they hold it whenever a pope needs to be done, whenever a pope dies or resigns, that's when they have the conclave. All right, so off and on, he painted this on with also the back wall of the Last Judgment, about 30 years. Again, spent a lot of time on his back. Incredibly detailed, right? There's even like stories that the Pope, that I think it was Julius II, and him would get into arguments. That's not like the guy was not big into taking any type of criticism. You're yelling at a Pope, all right? So I'll start tomorrow with this. I'll show you like some of the panels, and we'll talk about the paging of the Last Judgment and all some stuff. And then we'll talk about the other Ninja Turtles, the last two Ninja Turtles, Leonardo, Raphael, and then some other artists like Botticelli.
But I knocked over her canister.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things, man, they sound like weapons.
Hey, don't say that.
Well, they sound like